In addition to being a writer, Mr. Toobin is a legal analyst at CNN.
Please give a warm welcome to Mr. Jeffrey Toobin.
I know a good charter school when I see one. I know something about charter schools, and I am so thrilled to be a small part of helping out what you do here. And it is such a thrill to see how it has succeeded. And I'm really delighted to be a part of the high school and now the middle school of DeMario and Isabella. And thank you for having me. Now, you're probably wondering, who's your favorite Supreme Court justice? It's what we call in television a segue. It doesn't have to make any sense in particular, but you just sort of move from one thing to another. Sometimes you have a commercial that allows you to sort of go on, but there are no commercials here. We're up to $89,000. DeMario, get back up here. We want to get up to 200,000. No, sit down. I met DeMario earlier. He's very, very shy, as you can tell, right? What a ham, God. Oh, fantastic. That's great. Anyway, wow, that's terrific. Who's my favorite Supreme Court justice? Okay, well, see, this is a harder question than it used to be because I had a favorite Supreme Court justice for a long time, David Souter, but he's gone now. And I love David Souter for many reasons, but partly because he was just and is just so weird. This guy, he leads a 19th century, perhaps even 18th century life in the 21st century. He doesn't have a computer. He doesn't have a cell phone. He doesn't like electric light. It's true, he moves his chair around his chambers over the course of the day to catch the sunlight. He eats the same thing for lunch every day. He has a cup of yogurt and an apple, including the core. It's true. But the great thing about Justice Souter is that he had a wonderful perspective on what it meant to be a Supreme Court justice, because he understood how the court is very important. Everybody understands how significant its rulings are, but the justices themselves are largely unknown to the public. And he sometimes even had a little fun with that, and I'll give you an example. Now, for reasons that remain obscure, David Souter and Stephen Breyer of Lowell High School. I know we can mention Lowell High School. It's another high school. I know it's a good. It's not Gateway, but it's okay. David Souter and Stephen Breyer are frequently mistaken for each other. Now, if you know what they look like, they don't look anything alike, but it happens to both of them still fairly often. And one time, not too long ago, Justice Souter, as he often did, was driving from Washington to his home in New Hampshire, and he stopped in a little restaurant in Massachusetts to get something to eat. And he's sitting there, and a couple comes up to him, and the guy says, "I know you. You're on the Supreme Court, right?" He said, "Yeah." He says, "You're Stephen Breyer, right?" And Souter didn't want to embarrass the fellow in front of his wife, so he says, "Yes, I'm Stephen Breyer." So they're talking for a little while, but then there was a question that Souter wasn't ready for. The guy says, so Justice Breyer, what's the best thing about being on the Supreme Court?" And he thought for a minute. He said, "I'd have to say it's the privilege of serving with David Souter." How can you not love that guy, right? But he's gone now, and I need a new favorite justice. Okay, well, let's start. We'll talk about the Supreme Court by the numbers. We have 6 men and 3 women. First time in history, there are 3 women on the Supreme Court. There are 6 Catholics and 3 Jews. There are no Protestants on the Supreme Court. Sometimes, weirdly, that gets applause. I'm not sure why, but There are representatives of 4 New York City boroughs on the Supreme Court. Sonia Sotomayor is from the Bronx, Antonin Scalia is from Queens, Ruth Ginsburg is from Brooklyn, and Elena Kagan is from Manhattan. Tragically, Staten Island is unrepresented on the Supreme Court, but perhaps future appointments will address that. Anyway, those are a few facts about the Supreme Court, and I think they're interesting facts, but a significant fact about the Supreme Court. There are 5 Republicans and 4 Democrats. Now, I'm going to talk for somewhat longer about the court, but you now know most of what you need to know about the contemporary Supreme Court. There are 5 Republicans and 4 Democrats. This is an evenly divided court, but with a real and continuing Republican majority in most cases. And the court has been evenly or almost evenly divided like that for quite some time. And to see why this moment is so significant, I think you need to go back in history a little bit to see why this moment is so significant. To the last time the court was not evenly divided, the last time there was a substantial ideological majority, which was sort of the mid and late 1960s, or when Earl Warren was Chief Justice, and you had 7 liberals on the Supreme Court. And you had a real liberal agenda. The court was moving to the left in basically every way, and Earl Warren and William Brennan, his great deputy, would meet every Saturday morning, and they'd say, "What are we going to do? How are we going to push the law?" And year after year, that's precisely what they did. 1964, New York Times against Sullivan, Justice Brennan's famous opinion, changing libel law and giving the press important new protections. 1965, Justice Douglas's opinion in Griswold versus Connecticut, the case that said there was a right to privacy implicit in the Constitution, and it said that married couples could no longer be prevented from buying birth control. 1966, Chief Justice Warren's opinion in Miranda versus Arizona, revolutionizing criminal procedure, and perhaps more importantly, changing television dramas forever. Like everybody knows you have a right to remain silent, right? 1967, perhaps the best named case in the history of the Supreme Court. What was that case? Loving versus Virginia, of course. A case much in the news, the case of Loving. What was it about? It was about marriage. It was a case that said, states could no longer ban racial intermarriage. Imagine, 1967. It's really not that long ago when you think about it. And yet it wasn't until 1967 that the court got around to saying that people of different races could not be prevented from marrying one another. To put it in a different way, in 1960, when Barack Obama's parents got married in Hawaii, their marriage was a crime in 19 states, and there were people in prison in this country for that crime in 1960. So it is worth pausing to recognize and frankly to celebrate how much the country's changed and how laws like that are not only just unconstitutional, but they are unthinkable. And that was the way the court was in the late 1960s. But you never know how Supreme Court vacancies are going to work. Jimmy Carter is the only president in American history to serve a full term but have no appointments to the Supreme Court. There were just no vacancies while he was president. But Richard Nixon was only president for 5.5 years. You'll recall he had to leave early. But he got 4 appointments to the Supreme Court. Who left? Chief Justice Earl Warren left, Abe Fortas, John Harlan, and Hugo Black all left while Nixon was president, and Nixon got to name his replacements. Well, who did he name? He named Chief Justice Warren Burger, Harry Blackmun, Lewis Powell, and William Rehnquist. And as you think about Nixon's appointments to the Supreme Court, I think it illustrates something about the Supreme Court, but it also illustrates something about American politics, something that I think is the biggest development in American politics in our lifetime, which is the evolution of the Republican Party. Much on display this week. The Republican Party of the 1970s was a moderate party for the most part. Was a party that was not socially conservative, that was not religiously oriented, that was not opposed to the fundamental idea of government. It was more conservative than the Democratic Party. But the Republican Party of today is so different, and that's why we saw what happened this week in Washington, is because the contemporary Republican Party does not share any ideological common ground, certainly with the Democratic Party, but even with its predecessors in the Republican Party. And you saw that in Nixon's appointments to the Supreme Court, because a lot of people thought, oh, Nixon got 4 appointments, it's going to change the court dramatically, but it didn't. And in fact, the Supreme Court in the 70s was nearly as liberal as the Supreme Court in the 60s. Think about the big decisions of that period. The Nixon tapes case, they essentially forced Nixon out of office. Pentagon Papers case, they approved school busing. They ended the death penalty in the United States in 1972, though they let it back in 1976. And still, the most controversial decision of them all, 1973, Roe versus Wade, the case that said states could no longer ban abortion, that was a 7-2 opinion. And the only 2 dissenters in Roe v. Wade were Byron White, who was appointed by President Kennedy, and William Rehnquist. So 3 of the 4 Nixon justices were in the majority in Roe v. Wade. Just an unthinkable thing now. Well, the changes began in 1980 with the election of Ronald Reagan. And Ronald Reagan brought with him to Washington someone who is, I think, a very underrated figure in recent American history, and that's Edwin Meese, a former assistant district attorney just across the bay in Alameda County. And he brought with him to Washington. He was an aide to Reagan and later the attorney general, and he said, look, there is a liberal agenda. We need a conservative agenda, too. And Meese, very self-consciously, very intentionally, said, we're going to appoint judges and justices who reflect that agenda. Well, what was that agenda? Expand executive power, end racial preferences intended to assist African Americans, speed up executions, welcome religion into the public sphere, and above all, reverse Roe versus Wade and allow states once again to ban abortion. A big part of the Reagan agenda for the courts was the arrival in Washington of a group of young, brilliant, conservative lawyers who wanted to be part of it. And who were 2 of the best and the brightest of that group? John Roberts and Samuel Alito. You know, some of the documents that came out from that period were very revealing. 1985, in a memo plotting litigation strategy in the Solicitor General's office, Alito wrote, "What can be made of this opportunity to advance the goal of bringing about the eventual overruling of Roe v. Wade?" Later that year, applying for a promotion in the Justice Department, he wrote, "I am particularly proud of my contributions to recent cases in which the government has argued in the Supreme Court that the Constitution does not protect the right to an abortion." Samuel Alito then, Samuel Alito now. But the Republican Party of Ronald Reagan was not the Republican Party of today either. And we saw that in Reagan's appointments to the Supreme Court, 1981. Potter Stewart unexpectedly announced that he was stepping down. Reagan had made a campaign promise that Jimmy Carter didn't even make. Reagan said, if I have the chance, I am going to appoint the first woman to the Supreme Court. Reagan had a vacancy. He said to his people, look, I made a promise, I'm going to keep it. Find me a qualified woman. It was not a simple thing to do that in 1981, particularly for a Republican. There were not a lot of Republican women in the traditional pipelines for the Supreme Court, circuit court judges and the like. And Reagan's people had to go all the way to the intermediate appeals court, not even the highest court in Arizona, to find the remarkable figure who was and is Sandra Day OConnor. But Sandra Day OConnor was not a social conservative. She was not a religious conservative. She was always a moderate conservative, and that was just fine with Ronald Reagan, who was not himself what we would today call a movement conservative. 1986, Warren Burger stepped down as Chief Justice. Reagan elevated William Rehnquist from Associate Justice to Chief Justice, named Antonin Scalia. No question. Conservative justice then, conservative justice now. 1987, Lewis Powell stepped down, and it was an especially important vacancy because Powell was the swing vote of his day. He was the justice who controlled the outcome of a lot of cases, so it was very important who replaced him. And what did Ronald Reagan do? He nominated Robert Bork. And something very important had happened between the confirmation of Scalia and Rehnquist in '86 and the nomination of Bork in '87. The Democrats had retaken control of the United States Senate, and the chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee was no longer Strom Thurmond of South Carolina, but instead a young senator from Delaware named Joseph Biden. And Biden engineered hearings on Robert Bork that were a searching inquiry into Bork's view. And Bork, I think to his credit, although I think also to his regret, Bork answered all the questions that were put to him. He engaged the senators about his views, and he said, I do not think there is a right to privacy in the Constitution. And he had said the Civil Rights Act was a monstrous thing. And the Senate said, too conservative. And he was voted down 58-42. Ronald Reagan, facing reality, nominated to that seat instead Anthony Kennedy, Sacramento, not far from here. And Anthony Kennedy is certainly no liberal, but he is certainly not what Robert Bork would have been on the Supreme Court. And that really set the stage for the Rehnquist years on the court. There was really not a lot of change. And when I started reporting about the Supreme Court, I was inspired by a book that I suspect is familiar to at least some of you, called The Brethren by Bob Woodward and Scott Armstrong, which was really the first behind-the-scenes book about the Supreme Court. And the theme of The Brethren was how all the justices, without regard to politics, couldn't stand Warren Burger. They thought he was a pompous jerk, and there was all this infighting. And if you look at the history of the Supreme Court, that's really more the rule than the exception. I don't know how many of you have had the misfortune to hear of a justice named James McReynolds, who served on the court from 1914 to 1941, who was such an appalling anti-Semite that he used to get up and leave the conference room whenever Justice Cardozo or Justice Brandeis would speak. Just a prince of a human being. William O. Douglas, a cantankerous liberal who served on the court from 36 years, longer than anyone in history. You know, that was kind of the rule rather than the exception in the history of the court. And as I started work on the court, I thought, great, I'm going to see all the juicy fights that went on in the Rehnquist years. Well, somewhat to my disappointment as a journalist, if my satisfaction as a citizen, I learned that wasn't the case. William Rehnquist was always very popular among his colleagues. One reason he was very popular is he engineered a tremendous reduction in the court's workload. In the 80s, the Supreme Court was deciding about 150 cases a year. By 2005, when Rehnquist died, they were deciding about 75 cases a year. Do the math. 75 cases divided by 9 justices, divided by 4 law clerks apiece. It's a pretty cushy job being on the Supreme Court. It's like, no wonder they live so long, right? I mean, you write a few opinions. In the 80s, the workload got so great that there was actually a proposal to add a sort of super appeals court between the Circuit Courts of Appeals and the Supreme Court. Warren Burger was supporting this proposal. It went to the White House counsel's office for evaluation. And the White House counsel assigned a young lawyer on his staff to write a memo about it. And that young lawyer was named John Roberts. And this is what young John Roberts wrote. While some of the tales of woe emanating from the court are enough to bring tears to the eyes, it is true that only Supreme Court justices and school children are expected to and do take the entire summer off. The Chief Justice does not talk this way anymore. The entire summer off looks pretty good from where he's sitting. And it is true also that the Supreme Court remains basically a congenial place. The justices get along with each other pretty well. And to see that, you need only go to a Supreme Court oral argument. And I hope you all, I'm sure in a group like this, many of you have been, but I hope if you have the chance, you should go to a Supreme Court oral argument. It is really the best free show in Washington. And there is, of course, And it wasn't even closed during the shutdown. There is, of course, one very well-known fact about Supreme Court oral arguments, and that is that there are 8 justices who are very engaged and very prepared and ask lots of hard questions, and Clarence Thomas never says anything. February 22nd, 2006. That was the last time Clarence Thomas asked a question. We're now in year 8 of Clarence Thomas's reign of silence at the court. And those of us who see, go off into Supreme Court arguments, you can't help but sit there and think, will this be the day? Nothing's stopping him. He could just ask a question and you think, will this be the day? But it never is. It never is. But this is the great thing. This is the thing about Justice Thomas, is that he's not silent during oral arguments. He sits between Breyer and Kennedy, seniority order, and they pass notes, they tell jokes, they laugh. Thomas is not an isolated or unpopular figure at the Supreme Court, nor an uninfluential figure at the Supreme Court. Just for his own bizarre reasons, he chooses never to ask any questions. Now, when thinking about the Rehnquist Court, I think it's useful to divide it into 2 parts, 1986 to 2000 and 2000 to 2005. And the dividing point in the history of the court, and in many respects, a dividing point in the history of our country, is the court's decision in Bush v. Gore. Now, I admit I'm kind of obsessed with Bush v. Gore. Justice Scalia is a terrific public speaker, does a lot of talking to groups, like this one, and they'll take questions, and he often gets a kind of hostile question about Bush v. Gore. He's like, oh yeah, what about Bush v. Gore? And Justice Scalia always says the same thing. Oh, get over it. But actually, I'm not over it all these years later. My last book before the 9 was a book called Too Close to Call about the recount in Florida, and for that book I tried to interview Al Gore. Obviously going to write a book on that subject, you'd want to talk to Al Gore. Well, he didn't talk to me. He didn't want to relive the experience, so I wrote the book without him. Well, while I was working on the 9, I met Al Gore at a social occasion, and we were chatting. He'd read Too Close to Call, and we were talking. And I said to him, Mr. Vice President, you're not going to believe this, but I'm writing another book where Bush v. Gore is just at the center of it. I said, I must be the biggest Bush v. Gore junkie in the world. And he said, you may be second. He probably has a point there, right? But something peculiar happened at the Supreme Court after 2000. The court got more liberal. The court moved to the left. After 2000, they ended the death penalty for the juvenile offenders. They ended the death penalty for the mentally retarded. They decided Lawrence v. Texas that said that gay people couldn't be thrown in prison for having consensual sex. They saved affirmative action in the University of Michigan Law School case, and they rejected the Bush administration's position on Guantanamo Bay and the detainees there in case after case. Why? Why did the court move to the left after Bush v. Gore? Well, remember what I said about the Republican Party, and in particular about Sandra Day OConnor. She saw George W. Bush and his administration, and she grew more and more alienated from the modern Republican Party. She didn't like John Ashcroft. She didn't like the way the war on terror was being conducted. She didn't like the war in Iraq. And above all, Justice O'Connor was alienated by something that doesn't get talked about a lot now, but is, I think, a really important event in the history of the last decade, and that's the Terry Schiavo case. Terry Schiavo case, as you recall, was about who should make critically ill decisions for a critically ill family member, and it was at precisely that time that Justice O'Connor was dealing with the sad descent of her beloved husband John into Alzheimer's disease. So it wasn't just an abstraction to her, that case, and she didn't like it. But in 2005, she said, look, I want to take care of John. And she decided she had to step down. And the very same summer that she stepped down, William Rehnquist died of cancer. So there were 2 simultaneous vacancies on the Supreme Court, and George W. Bush replaced them with representatives of the modern Republican Party. John Roberts and Samuel Alito are more conservative than their predecessors. Roberts is more conservative than Rehnquist, and Alito is a lot more conservative than Justice O'Connor, and the court now reflects that. The court now reflects that more conservative balance, whether it is ending the school integration plans in Seattle and Louisville, or rejecting the attempts of class actions to challenge discrimination in Walmart and elsewhere. Most importantly, perhaps, it is evident in the signature decision of the Roberts years, the Citizens United case, about essentially deregulating American campaigns. And Stephen Breyer, who is no hysteric, said not too long ago, "It is not often in law that so few have quickly undone so much." So it is not often in law that so few have quickly undone so much. Now, Supreme Court justices ultimately vote with their feet. They decide when to leave the court and when to hand that precious seat to which president. And they take that decision very seriously. And it is worth pausing to reflect on the last three justices to leave the court. Sandra Day OConnor, this tall, charismatic, outgoing former politician from Arizona. David Souter, the shy, reclusive bachelor from New Hampshire. John Paul Stevens, the wily antitrust lawyer from Chicago. So different in personality, but so similar in one important way. They were all moderate Republicans who left the Supreme Court completely alienated from the Republican Party. Souter and Stevens so alienated that they handed their precious seat to a Democratic president, Barack Obama, who replaced them with Sonia Sotomayor and Elena Kagan, whose votes essentially duplicate those of Stevens and Souter. But that tells you where the court is right now. And the moderate Republicans on the Supreme Court, just as the moderate Republicans in the Senate, are gone. Last term, we saw it dramatically, and we saw the one exception. Anthony Kennedy is a conservative in almost every area except gay rights. There have been three major gay rights decisions in the history of the Supreme Court. Lawrence v. Texas, which I mentioned earlier, the Romer decision, and of course last year, the decision declaring the Defense of Marriage Act unconstitutional. Anthony Kennedy wrote all three opinions. And he is someone who simply believes in equality for gay. Sorry? Oh, my microphone died? Well, I guess that's a hint. But I'm actually kind of almost done. So, but that case was an aberration to the generally conservative tilt of the court, which we saw most dramatically last year in the Voting Rights Act case. Not quite. Does that work? Hey, Voting Rights Act. I'll wander around. In the Voting Rights Act case, which took the most successful civil rights law in the history of the United States and essentially ended it. And that's the modern Supreme Court. And that's where we stand right now. Now you may ask, as I conclude, what's the future look like? And I, in the best law school tradition, will answer that question with a question, which is, well, who's the next president going to be? Because if Barack Obama is followed by 8 years of Hillary Clinton and 8 years of Andrew Cuomo, and then 8 years of Kamala Harris, nothing like a little pandering to the local crowd, we're going to have one kind of Supreme Court. But if Barack Obama is followed by 8 years of Ted Cruz and 8 years of Marco Rubio, we're going to have a different kind of Supreme Court. And I don't know who it's going to be. Thank you for supporting me.